Illinois State Representative LaShawn Ford has called for the abolition of history classes in the state's public schools. He says current history teachings lead to white privilege in a racist society. And so his solution is to simply abolish the teaching of history as we've known it, as they've known it in the schools in Illinois. And there's a bill to make teaching history illegal. And he thinks a rewrite of history is in order, but in the meantime, he believes we should simply stop teaching it because he thinks history is dangerous. And he's right. History is dangerous. And this is why leftists so desperately want to get rid of history and make people ignorant of their own inheritance. And since the dawn of the 20th century, and this is what I'd like to look at, and this is a little bit of a long video, but please stick around to the end because it gets more interesting as we go. Since the beginning of the 20th century, leftists have used every means in their power to accelerate the total nullification of history, just like Representative Ford is determined to do. And why do they do this? Because to control the future, which is what any tyrant wants to do, you've got to control or erase the past, or at least define the past your way. And if you can do that, you really can be in control of the present and the future. If you want to know why people like Congressman Ford want history just totally gone, and why hard left rioters and protesters are destroying every historical monument they can, here are some of the highlights on the war on history from the last 100 years or so. So let's look at this together. We'll start with Russia. We tend to think that Russians were the most brutal social engineers, and the Soviets they really were masters at mind control and the erasing of history. The photo on the left was taken in May 1920 during a speech by Lenin at the Sverdlov Square. Kamenev and Trotsky are standing right there next to Lenin, faithful followers of Lenin, right on the steps to the platform. But then the official photo, the official historical photo to the right was published after Kamenev and Trotsky fell out of favor with Lenin, were hunted down and killed, and of course erased from the history books and the photographs and the statues and everything else. The Soviets took total and full advantage of every technology that would help create a false version of the past and a managed version of the future. They attempted to own sovereignty to the best of their ability, to own predestination to the best of their ability. And so has every Marxist social engineer in any position of influence in any Western nation since, including America. At the same time, the early 20th century, the same things were going on, and this is what I want to show you. Rewriting history is just simply part of the drill. Tearing down statues is part of the drill. In April 1918, the Bolshevik government, headed by Lenin, he totally understood this. He signed a major decree called On the Monuments of the Republic. All statues were to be demolished. And, by the way, all statutes too. He was after the law. He wanted to destroy the law. But he realized that visually, the things that the people knew and could see about their past were memorializations of the past, had to be demolished. So that's what this decree did. They were to be demolished. All statues were to be demolished unless they were irrelevant to history or culture. And so the Soviets believed those who control the flow of information can arrange, by force of dictate, force of decree, force of law, can arrange the forced disappearance of truth and events and persons and records. So what does this communicate? It communicates that historic documents and statues really are important. Revolutionaries must give them revolutionary meaning. False documents must be created in order to make an official version of history that is contrary to what actually happened. Records of life and death and law and order and centuries of civil progress are simply erased, especially any clear record of Western civilization or Christianity, what it looked like, or due process of law and what that looked like, because tyranny cannot possibly exist under those things, and so they have to go. They have to just be disappeared. New photographs and even new statues to revolutionary sorts of heroes are then created. Filmmaker Lilia Brick was not allowed to be remembered as someone who had actually lived. Abel Yenukidze was purged from life and history, and so was the NKVD boss, Nikolai Yezhov, who was arrested and executed in 1939. A new historical record gives a new context for the worldview of every citizen. Retouched photographs are nothing less than false historic documents. False books are the very same thing. Statues of criminals or revolutionary citizens hold the same purpose. The Soviets discovered that they could not only revise history, they could also confuse history, and so confuse it that it declared only a message of disorder and despair and confusion and pessimism. And they learned this: if you teach nothing but meaningless dates and events with no context, any student of history will hate it. And if you can identify with me, I hated it. The trivia we had to memorize and take notes on and have tests on taught me, and this was really clever. It so destroyed in me any interest that I might have had to look into history because I was conditioned to hate it. It was a closed door for me. I just didn't want to go there. I didn't want to bother with it. What they had been showing me, these little trivial facts out of context, caused me just to disdain it. And what a perfect victory that was. And this war on reality did not stop in Russia with the fall of the USSR in 1989. On a recent talk show in Moscow, the prominent political analyst Mikhail Delyagin said something critical of Vladimir Putin. And when the program was televised, Delyagin was not there, except for, in one shot, his disembodied legs. And the president of the Russian Academy of Television recently admitted, quote, that the thing that nobody wants to talk about is that we do not have freedom of the press when it comes to the television networks. So how much is network TV controlled in the United States?
Common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish stories that simply aren't true without checking facts first. Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 Of course, enemies of truth cannot completely destroy history, but they can turn it into a tool of deliberate confusion and social control. In this new world of fake history and fake news, a secular elite rules the minds and consciences and families and property of all citizens. And this is why governments maintain a dictatorship over the past, the present, and the future of all men. And this is really what this is the most important part of a dictatorship. Yeah, of course they want to control the material world too, all the possessions, all the people. But first they have to really have a good grip on the control of the past and the future and then the present. And this is why they really hate history. The past is providential. It's really full of meaning and really full of coherence. And it's really full of stories about how the bad guys don't win. They get overturned by well-educated, well-meaning people who come against them and stand against them, heroic people. And so tyrants fear the future just as much as they fear the history of the past, because the future is unpredictable and uncontrollable, unless they hold all the levers of control and manipulation. And one of those levers makes the population totally ignorant of history and then dependent on social planners. Jay Leno discovered that the average man on the street in New York City doesn't know any history or geography. The average man, of course. He doesn't know what WW2 means, but he does know the meaning of ROTFLMAO.
What was the name of the ship Pilgrim sailed to America on?
Yeah.
Landed in Plymouth Rock. The ship is the same name as a famous moving company.
U-Haul?
Leaving the story of Russia right now, America, we have to admit, America fell victim to revolutionary revisionism early in the 20th century also. In fact, the war against history was fought and won. And this is really an important part of my message here today. It was fought and won in 20 short years. It didn't just start then and just slowly come to fruition and victory now in the year 2020. No, in 20 short years, at the early part of the 20th century, most of the fighting and the winning was done. One of the most direct summaries of the century was written by American educator Sam Blumenfeld, the late Sam Blumenfeld. He said, "The plain truth is that there has been in this country a deliberate plan to change the nature of the American education system so that the American people could be easily led into socialism." And when you look at the internet now and on the streets and the protesters and see how readily and willingly and enthusiastically they've embraced socialism, you can see the victory, in living color now. And so let's look at this story. What happened in the early 20th century? We pick up the story in 1900. American, government schooling, public schooling, was really a new thing in America. It had not been present from the founding of America 3 centuries before. Widespread, compulsory, forced government schooling had only been in place for one cycle at that point, kindergarten to graduation. That's it. It was a new thing. The forced version, which began early in Massachusetts, parents had to be led into the government school system at the point of bayonet. Well, rather the children and the parents, because the parents would not go along with the idea. Gradually, America got used to it. And that's a whole other story in itself. But here we are discussing John Dewey, one of the architects of this new forced government education system. He wrote a pedagogic creed in 1897, and it had just been distributed to the teachers around America. And it was among educators that energetic attacks on history, the attackers found allies. Here's what he said, John Dewey: "Every teacher should realize he's a social servant set apart for the maintenance of the proper social order." And Dewey was a big advocate of communism and socialism, the proper social order, and that the securing of the right social growth. In this way, the teacher is always the prophet of the true God and the usherer in of the true kingdom of heaven. Now, he wasn't talking about the biblical kingdom of heaven. He was talking about his own version, meaning a socialist utopia. Harold Rugg, R-U-G-G, was part of Dewey's small circle of social engineers headquartered at Columbia Teachers College. Rugg was the most effective strategist for the new social order that they intended to create through an education cartel. That was the plan. They realized that that's how they could succeed. They'd never get adults to go along with it, but if they could indoctrinate children over a period of years, it would be possible. Here's what he said, quote, "A new public mind is to be created." And then they're talking about the entire population thinking the same way. How? Only by creating tens of millions of individual minds and welding them together into a new social mind. Old stereotypes must be broken up and new climates of opinion formed in the neighborhoods of America. He goes on to say and write, "Education must be used to condition the people to accept social change. The chief function of the schools is to plan the future of society." And again, what is their plan? What society are they looking for? And in their writings, well, you can see those writings in the early days of the 20th century were full of praise in the 1920s and the 1930s for the practices of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Empire. Rugg was a socialist, and he was a revolutionary, and his life was devoted to social engineering. And for this, he required and obtained a large war chest, the equivalent of multi-millions of dollars from the large family foundations like Rockefeller and Carnegie, which had become like almost a fourth branch of government in the U.S. Their vast financial powers were used to steer and create American policy. In later years, the U.S. Congress took the initiative to find out how Rugg's self-appointed educators were so effective at changing the opinions of America. Now, this is all in the congressional record. There was a U.S. congressional committee called the Reese Committee, And a researcher for this committee named Norman Dodd discovered that the Carnegie Endowment had a policy that lies entirely, and this is what he said, that policy lies entirely in the changing of the teaching of the history of the United States. It lies entirely in the changing of the teaching of the history of the United States to children, to school children. And then he goes on and he tracked this, and this is part of his research. He says, in 1909, they approached 5 of the then most prominent historians in this country with the proposition, and they had a lot of money to pay them, with the proposition that they alter the manner of the teaching of the subject of history, and that they get, and then he says, they get turned down flatly by these 5 historians, these true historians. So they, the endowment and their followers, like Rudd, they realized that they then must build their own stable of historians, so to speak. Ultimately, a group of 20 are so assembled, and that becomes the nuclei of the policies which emanate to the American Historical Association. It sounds really prestigious, doesn't it? But it was a group of revolutionaries. They weren't true historians. They weren't honest historians. But they found 20 of them who took the money to begin altering the teaching of history in the United States, to undo the history, the true history, the accurate history of the United States. Subsequently, he writes, around 1928, the Carnegie Endowment, and keep these dates in mind. You see how hot the battle was even back then. And it's about to be, the war is just about to be finished, just about to be won by 1928. The Carnegie Endowment granted to the American Historical Association $400,000. That was a massive amount of money at that time. $400,000 in order to make a study of what the future of this country will probably turn out to be and should be. And remember their dream. They had a dream of a utopia which was not traditionally American or Christian, but communistic and socialistic. That's what they wanted. That's what they appreciated about the Soviet Union at that time. They came up with a 7-volume set of books, the last volume being a summary and digest of the other 6. In the last volume, the answer is as follows. This is what the future is supposed to look like. The future in the United States belongs to collectivism, administered with characteristic American efficiency. So what they want to do is take full advantage of the work ethic that exists in the United States of America, the character of the people. They want to so twist the minds of the people that they will still have these abilities to be dependable people, dependable workers, and they will put together this system of collectivism and let the social engineers run it and obey every command that comes down from on high to be perfectly politically correct, obediently politically correct. Harold Rugg, William Kilpatrick, and these other men listed here on the screen, this is the group of leaders who put these ideas together for all the other academics in America to follow. The American educational leaders were agreed on this goal. For the American people, the age of individualism is closing, and the age of collectivism, which is just another word for socialism, the age of collectivism is opening. And, you know, they were actually right, because they were succeeding so spectacularly with young children. And they could see what was going to be happening in the 1930s, 1940s, when these young children came of age. Here's the central and dominating reality in the present epoch. It stands on a particular interpretation of American history, and this is what they understood. It accepts the conclusions and recommendations, the master plan of the American Historical Association, and this was written in the Social Frontier magazine. And so, do you see the point that they're making? There has to be an interpretation of American history that's completely different from the truth, from what really happened. We won't be able to move into the future unless we can so discredit the founders and the ways, and their families, and the ways that they lived and worked and tried to build the country and tried to prize the freedom that they fought for. If people appreciate that, they will always defend it. But if we can discredit them, we will in shame want to turn away from it and move into something we're told is better and safer and more honorable and more moral. And that's what they were trying to sell school children. And you know, I got it in the 1950s. I got this in the 1960s. Another quote, further quote, the age of individualism and laissez-faire in economy and government is closing. Okay, laissez-faire just means letting people do what they want with their lives and their money. You don't tax it away from them and redistribute it by, you know, some experts do it. We let people do as they choose in the country, take full advantage of all the freedoms that they enjoy in the country. But individualism and this laissez-faire attitude in economy and government is closing. We don't get to elect the people that we want anymore. A new age of collectivism is emerging, a corresponding enlargement of the functions of government and an increasing state intervention in fundamental branches of economy previously left to individual discretion and initiative. We don't want any more individual discretion and initiative, starting of businesses, saving of money, thrift, the investment of money in the companies that we want to invest in. This is all closing. And this is the picture of the American Historical Association that they say they will be embracing as the plan and the model for the future. We must create a new climate of opinion in our communities. To the uprooting of ingrained concepts, we must commit ourselves. And this is Harold Rugg, writing in his book, The Great Technology. I mean, he's sounding a little bit like Yoda, but this is how he talked. You know, we have to commit ourselves to the uprooting of ingrained concepts like faithfulness, honoring of parents, a sound work ethic that truly is honest. I mean, they want to uproot all those things. Mother, father, soil, religion, community, because they're trying to build a whole new mentality, and they will be using technology to do it. Harold Rugg spoke for the Utopians when he wrote this. And look at this quote really carefully. The elimination of history is really the key to the whole program for a new social order. The elimination of history. And so look at, you know, these congressmen all over the country who encourage and look favorably on the destruction of statues, who are standing up and shaking their fists and saying we have to eliminate the teaching of history in our classrooms. This is the key for the whole program for a new social order. He organized the writing of false textbooks and curriculum for high school and grade school kids. His focus was creating totally invalid history, and that's a word that he used, invalid history. He knew there was a difference between true history and his new created version, which he knew was invalid. He wanted it to be invalid. He wanted students to study the invalid history. And only those events were selected to go into his books. And they were twisted in the way that they were, but they were put in. Some of them actually were put in. I've looked at a lot of these early textbooks from the 1920s. Only those that would convey a radical negation of God's providence, a radical negation. And first, he and his colleagues worked to discredit the heroes of American history in all these projects, which reached millions of students in the 1920s and the 1930s. There was the Building America series, the textbooks of Dr. Charles Beard, who was just a cynic who used the doctrines of critical theory in his writing. The Encyclopedia of Social Sciences, the citizenship education courses, and you can still find some of these used on the internet to buy and look at, and they really are poison. But this is what our parents grew up with. This is what we grew up with. Where was opposition to this? You know, American churches should have been speaking up about this, but this is really interesting. The churches are really to blame for a lot of what happened here. They turned a blind eye, or they were just simply seduced into the idea. In 1919, the American Baptist Society published its own book. It was called The New World Order, written by a man named W.Z. Batten. It was referring to the need for social control. Yes, we'll turn control over to the government. We need a new world order. We need a globalist new world order. They said, their words were, we need a globalist world federation. This is what these Baptist Christians were calling for back then. And so there was a study guide called Social Reconstruction. Okay, that's what they're thinking. Okay, we're going to reconstruct all of American society. And in this book, it summarized Rugg's own irreverent writings. And here's just a quick summary. The present order is unsatisfactory. The founding of America was a case of injustice and villainy, okay, which is a lie. But this is how he was thinking and what he was putting into his books. Next, collectivist planning is the only solution for the crisis of our time, that we don't have the crisis in their minds and the way they thought about this. We don't have a collectivist society. We don't have a socialistic society. We've got all this laissez-faire, people doing what individualism, doing what they want with their freedom. We have to reduce the liberties of the people and raise the size of the government. And so the 5 points of design that they were following has been summarized here. Christian society failed and must be replaced with collectivism, which elevates the state above the possibility of injustice. Do you get that? That means the state is infallible. The state can make its own laws. So whatever the state wants to make a law this week, it's totally right. If it makes a different law the next week, it's still totally right. This is what the Soviet Union would do. They would change the laws all the time, and no one could say they were wrong. No one could say this is inconsistent morality. No one could say there's a standard of morality that they need to follow. They could simply change any law, make any law, create any law as the lawmaker and never be called unjust, because the state becomes the new law. Freedom of the individual must be limited, and size of central government must grow. Profit systems must be discarded. That means goodbye to capitalism, period. Material culture must replace spiritual culture. Centralized schooling must provide the framework for all national and then international policy. Okay. And so confident were they that the hearts of the children could be aligned with this statist version, that the anti-parent and anti-academic curriculum addressed the pupils as insiders. And I remember this when I was in grade school. I mean, it was kind of like I was being clued in on this massive new thing that was going on, and I was privy to it. They were honoring me by letting me into the secret, and even saying things that were very seductive, like, in the new society, you're kind of smart. You could be one of the leaders and the rulers in this. And we really need to get rid of the ways that we were thinking in the past. The evils of society can all be traced back to Christianity and the God of the Christians. Let's move forward to the scientific, secular statism of the future and the completely ordered society that the experts can take care of. I mean, that's what I was told, year after year after year. And so kids were invited to be woke as early as the 1910s. It's not a brand new thing. And what the schools taught, and this was basically, I got this message myself. I got this lesson. What the schools teach is cool. What parents teach is really uncool. Cool kids succeed in the world, but uncool kids don't have a hope to succeed in the world with the good jobs, the good titles, the good positions at the universities. No way that an uncool kid can do that. You need to be woke. You need to be politically correct. And so we learned that woke kids, the cool kids, the hip kids, that was the word when I was a child. They're politically correct, but traditional kids get nothing in the future. They're the losers in the future. Now, at the Education Research and Analysis Organization, the senior researcher Neil Frey has said this: no textbook used by the public school system has ever presented accurate American history. 2 popular textbooks used by Christian schools and home educators follow similar errors. This is the problem. And John Taylor Gatto, whom I've quoted before, New York Teacher of the Year, he said, they, meaning these social engineers, these engineers from the early 20th century, John Dewey and his friends and colleagues, they had a stupendous goal in mind: the rationalization of everything, the end of unpredictable history, its transformation into dependable order, but only an order that's being run by the scientific, secular, social engineers. And that's who they were. And they wanted us to understand that we didn't have to worry about a thing. They had everything under control. They were going to manage society and the economy. According to Gatto, the records of these foundations reveal clear political motivations and what they were up to, which line up perfectly with the Columbia Teachers College agenda. And so this, as he summarizes it, are these points. There appears a clear intention to mold people through schooling. In their writings, in the minutes of their organization, there is a clear intention to eliminate tradition and scholarship. There's a clear intention to weaken parental influence. There's a clear intention to overthrow accepted theological custom, meaning Christianity. And Edward Bernays, the author of that book, Crystallizing Public Opinion, concluded this, after all his research, that by 1928, are you still following the dates here? By 1928, America's worldview was by then in complete control of the people who had positioned themselves to shape the minds of school children. So in a little over 2 decades, socialist revolutionaries captured the future by making war on history. That's where they started, making war on history and teaching little school children and high school kids to distrust both the past and the future and to live irreverently in the present, looking to the social engineers in government to make everything safe and predictable by total social control. And really by the 1930s, it was really all over for history in the U.S. classrooms. Let me say that again. By 1930, this war against history, it was really finished. It was all over for history in U.S. classrooms. And Time magazine summed it up with this simple statement: 14 textbooks, pupils' workbooks of directed study, teachers' guides, in which the teacher is given the required answers to the posed questions and is instructed how to interpret historical facts, all designed to undo history.